So good afternoon also from my side. My name is Monika. I'm a business anchor at German international broadcaster DW, and it's my great pleasure now to moderate this next panel on decisions and analytics in the digital age. That's quite a mouthful when you think about it, but it is very, very interesting. I mean, the rise of artificial intelligence and big data, all of that we use every day now, certainly since the pandemic, with digitalization getting such a boost, so many people working in home office, so many of us, including us right now, doing this conference online, basically finally realizing, if not before, the benefits of digitalization and that we'd be pretty much lost without it. But at the same time, how much influence should all this technology have on decision making? I mean, just think of where I come from, TV broadcasting. A lot of it is being done online now, or put online now. And then obviously everybody is looking, how many clicks does a video have? So does it ultimately say that a video that gets 1,000 clicks is better, no matter what, than a video that only gets 100 clicks? Who is to decide that? Is it the algorithm? There are so many questions involved in this particular topic, and I'm very happy that I'm surrounded now, you see them right next to me, by fantastic experts who will help us to find out how gut feeling and how data, how that actually can maybe complement each other and where we should watch out. So I'm very happy to welcome, I'm starting clockwise, Gianluca Carnabuci. He's Professor of Organizational Behavior, and Ingrid, Manfred, Gentz Chair in Business and Society. Good to have you with us. Next to him we see, I presume it's Francis, because there is a French, yes, I get the thumbs up, Francis de Véricourt. He's Professor of Management and Science, or Management Science, and President's Chair and Director of the Center for Decisions, Models and Data. And then we have one lady on the panel, Catalina Stefanescu-Cuntze. She is Professor of Management Science and Deutsche Post DHL Chair. So good to have you all with us. We have roughly half an hour to talk about this issue and also include questions from the audience, which will be submitted. I'll have a look at the iPad in a moment. I don't mind actually including some of the questions early on already, so we don't have to wait for the last 5 minutes. But first of all, I would like to start with a round where each of you has approximately 3 minutes to basically give us his or her take on the issue, starting with Catalina, because before joining the European School of Management and Technology, you were Assistant Professor of Decision Sciences at London Business School, and today your research focuses on the design, analysis, and application of statistical models and methods for managerial decision making. And I'm saying this always beforehand so that we can better put what you're saying into context, because I would like to know, given your background and the research focus, how do you make good decisions and succeed in a digital age of information overload? Catalina, over to you.
Thank you, Monika. And well, yes, that is indeed the question, isn't it? And it's such a broad one. So I'm not sure I can give a definitive answer, but let me try to offer perhaps a couple of guiding principles that I personally have found helpful. And the first guiding principle would be to recognize that while we are indeed living in an age of information overload, it is critical to identify for any given decision what information is actually relevant. Now, that sounds obvious, but I'm not convinced that it is often done in practice. I've seen many instances where data has been gathered, the more the better, because some insights will come out of it. And to my mind, this is a little bit like putting the cart before the horses, whereas we should really start with a question. What is it that we're trying to solve? What's the decision that we need to make? And then ask ourselves, what kind of information is going to lead us to that decision? Now, once that has been defined, the second guiding principle would be to try to obtain that information from as wide a range of sources as possible. So, for instance, if you need an economic forecast, then don't just get one number, but try to get several from different, separate, independent sources. of course, on the principle that by averaging different inputs to the decision-making process, you're more likely to end up closer to the truth. And lastly, the third guiding principle that I would mention is that while of course data is a critical part of the decision-making process, it is by no means the whole story. And that is because, hard facts are rather funny in the sense that they need to be seen in context. And context is notoriously hard to capture and record in large databases. Context requires human judgment. Moreover, in many instances, decisions would have to be taken even when there is very little or perhaps no data available at all. And so I'm not a big fan of data-driven decision, because I think that the decisions should not be driven by the data, but they should be informed by it. And I think, for instance, the recent experience last year with the pandemic is a case in point. In the early days of the pandemic, there was very little information about infection rates and the spread of the virus and so on and so forth. And so widely different models were built about the evolution of infections and deaths and hospitalizations, and decisions had to be made in the absence of a lot of data. So the solution to that is, of course, to bring gut feeling into the picture. And once again, to get gut feeling not from one single source, but from a range of them. And to marry the hard facts with the soft facts in order to get optimal decisions. Ultimately recognizing that a decision is always a judgment call. And data by itself is not judgment. It's just a support for it.
I like that. Data might just serve, but ultimately not be the decision maker itself. I'm sure we'll revisit that again. Thank you so much, Catalina. I'd like to bring in Gianluca now. And Gianluca, your research interests revolve around the analysis of inter and intra-organizational networks, with particular regard to the generation and recombination of technological knowledge. Now, networks. First of all, what are we actually talking about when we talk about networks in a digital age, artificial intelligence? How do networks actually come into all that? And what role do they play? Gianluca.
Well, thanks for the question. It's an important clarification that I need to start with, because networks are not one single thing. There are many ways in which networks affect our life. I think the most important distinction at this point in history is between online social networks, which is what most people think about when we talk about networks in the digital age, and offline social networks, which are the networks of, let me say, trust-based relationships that we build around ourselves, whether or not we are online, with people with whom we exchange information, we exchange affect. Both of these aspects relate to the operations of networks and have an important effect on how people make decisions. In the digital age, of course, what we have observed is that the relative salience, the relative importance of online social networks has become much greater in many different ways compared to the importance of offline networks, but both still matter, and they matter in different ways. So I think the key intuition here that we want to bring with us is when we think about networks and how people make decisions in networks, we have to realize that people are, Herbert Simon, who is a Nobel Prize winner and one of the closest thing to a genius in our fields that I have ever come across, he said once, people are the most docile among the animal species. And what he meant by that is to say that people are very easily influenced by the social environment around them, and they adapt to it really, really quickly, which is great from an evolutionary standpoint. But when you look at it from the perspective of decision-making, what this intuition tells us is we are far more influenced by the networks around us than we like to think. And so digital networks affect our decisions in ways that are often imperceptible to us, but in a very powerful and deep way. They shape the information set that we have at our disposal, but more than that, they shape the ways in which we think about that information, how we interpret it, the objective function that we're trying to maximize through that information. And so ultimately, they shape everything in a decision-making process.
Well, thank you. So I'd never thought of humans as the most docile of all species. So there's certainly something I've learned today. It's a nice notion, even though I'm not quite sure if I can fully support that one. But maybe Francis can elaborate on that, because Francis, your research or general research interest is in the areas of analytics, operations, and decision science, with a current focus on health, care and sustainability. Well, focus on healthcare and sustainability right now is obviously absolutely cutting edge. From your perspective, what is the role of human-based decisions in an age of artificial intelligence? Do the two even meet?
Well, they compete and they meet. I think Catalina and Gianluca already said a lot. I want to probably take it where Catalina left it. That is, data, she said, is a means to help support a decision. I would go even further. I would say data is meaningless. Data is useless. Data never speaks by itself. So you can collect a lot of data, in the end is 0 and 1s. And the only way you can make use of it is by having an ability to interpret that data. And that ability comes from a very specific cognitive ability of the human being, which machines do not have, animals barely have. But what we have, the way we think, the way we decide, the way we solve problems, the way we understand the world, is by building representation of that world. And to be able to interpret data, you need to have the proper mental models, if you want, about how the world works to make sense of it. And so when you talk about humans versus machines, machines do not represent anything. In a sense, machine is really stuck very close to the data on which they are trained. And that's why Catalina insisted you need to have a lot of data from very different sources to be able for the machines to try to see many, many cases. But still, the machine will always be stuck to the data on which it is trained. What is very specific about human being and the way we make decisions is we have this ability to represent the world and go well beyond the data we have available. And I will go back to an example that Catalina used. You can think in terms of COVID epidemics. Right at the beginning of the epidemics, last year, you had some pharmaceutical company, Pfizer and BioNTech in particular, who would say right in February, these things is going to explode. These things deserve us to find a vaccine very, very, very early on. They could see that, not because of the data they have, not only about the gut feeling, it's because they had a very good representations about how an epidemics evolved in the world in that situations. So they could see an explosions, even though they didn't have the data to support it. So what makes us different from the machine? And if we want to survive the machine, if you want, we need to continue to be better at building mental representations about how the world works. And that's what helps us interpret the data, interpret what the machine does to make better decisions.
Well, thank you, Francis. And listening to you, it sounds to me almost like artificial intelligence, big data, digitalization, all those new technologies, while there is a benefit, there is a little bit of a threat as well, and we have to be careful and use it properly. Maybe going straight into let's look at artificial intelligence. Is there something, because there's no denying that it's being used and it's been more and more widespread. There are many studies out there saying that in the next 5 to 10 years, certainly a lot of the jobs that exist right now will be basically, they will be gone because artificial intelligence will replace them, robots will replace them. There has to be a benefit to it in order for the decision makers to know which way to go. Shall I give preference to the human being here or to the machine? where would artificial intelligence, for example, be preferable? Is there a field, Catalina, where you say this is definitely their playground and this is where artificial intelligence should have a say and be the one that we choose?
Well, I mean, I think the applications of artificial intelligence are obviously, as you pointed out, manifold, and I think we're going to see we're going to see them coming to life over the next few years. Quite a lot in many different industries and in many different contexts. I'd like maybe to mention two of them that I'm quite excited about and I'm quite passionate about. And one is in healthcare and the other one is in education. And I feel that in both of these domains, artificial intelligence has a huge promise as a support, once again, for decision making, not as a decision maker mechanism in itself, but really to support the human who ultimately has to take the decision. So in healthcare, for instance, for clinical trial, clinical development is a classic example. At the first stage that involves creating a lot of molecules and then sorting through those that have the highest chance of making it to the next stage and ultimately evolving into a successful drug. I think that's where actually artificial intelligence can help a lot into coming up with a hypothesis for basic research. Also the domain of personalized medicine, so coming up with treatments that very much target a patient's particular condition. That's another example. In education, being able to create personalized learning paths for individuals. Most of the educational programs in the past were designed for the average learner, the average child or teenager that would come through the school system. And I think there's value in using big data and learning approaches in order to design personalized learning of development. But of course, there's much more than that. And ultimately, I do have to emphasize, it's always a support tool rather than the decision maker in itself.
Right. Francis, Gianluca, if you would like to join, you don't always have to wait for me to say, right, now you're allowed to talk. But I do have another question. But of course, Francis, you offer.
No, I agree with what Catalina says, but I just maybe want to add that, and at the risk of repeating myself, is you will see the best applications of machine learning when you have the data to train them. And many of the problems we are facing, we don't have the data. Now, in healthcare, we have been collecting a lot of data. And in fact, we have the knowledge, the frame, the representation again, that enable us to elicit data. But even when you have enough data to train a machine and all that, you still need to go back to try to look at the problems you're facing in a very specific way, in a very specific frame, if you want. So if you take healthcare, since we're talking about healthcare, there has been a very interesting breakthrough last year. There has been a new antibiotic called halicin that has been discovered. You know that the bacteria are developing resistance to our antibiotics. And there's a new antibiotic that has been discovered. It has been on surface, be discovered by a machine. It's a machine learning algorithm that came up with these fantastic new antibiotics. But if you look behind the machine, there are people who started to represent the problems of finding an antibiotics differently. And this is this reframing of the problem that then enabled the machine with the data to find an innovative solutions. So where will you see application of machine learning? You need two things. You need to have enough data, which is already a big requirement, but you also need people to think about that problems in the right way so that you can start developing a machine.
You just said something very important also in terms of that you need the people behind it think in the right way. I've heard several times in similar contexts from scientists who deal with artificial intelligence in human resources in particular and recruiting, that artificial intelligence tends to be biased. Bias, unfortunately, to my gender, bias towards women. So obviously something, whoever created the artificial intelligence, there is a lot of human influence already there. We have to decide which is the right influence. So Gianluca, how can we, where do you see, how can we balance the human factor so that it is actually the docile, the nice, the kind influence and the machine ability to then in return actually support us in our endeavors?
So just as a clarification, Herb Simon didn't mean docile as in kind, he meant docile as adaptive. People who are able, so agents who are able to take information from the environment and shape their own way of thinking in a way that reflects that information. So I didn't mean to say that humans are always kind. They're not. They often are, but not always. But to your point, I think this is a great question. So Francis has just made an important point. You can't interpret data and be creative about data unless you first develop a mental model, what he would call a frame, that enables you to look at the data in a way that machines simply cannot do. I think there's one really important component of how we build these mental models that goes straight at your question, and that is the ethical dimensions of mental models. Machines cannot have ethical dimensions in the way that they operate because they are algorithms, and even when you operate an algorithm in a perfect way, what you're going to see is that that is ethics free. It doesn't have values in it. Values or ethics needs to be built into the way that the algorithm operates, and that can only be done both technically and, let me say, philosophically by human beings. It can't happen in any other way. So some of the examples that you guys were bringing up concerning, for example, AI in medicine, ultimately, artificial intelligence is going to be wonderfully useful to crunch the data once we have decided what our mental models are that we all agree upon and what principles, ethical principles, those mental models need to be able to incorporate. So that said, machines can generate biases on their own. They can generate biases just simply because of the fact that they are built on data that humans produce. And because humans are biased, the data on which machines operate are by necessity biased. So that's an additional problem on top of what I just described, which also requires some creative way to think about how we're gonna develop and operate artificial intelligence in the future.
If I can jump in, so please. I think, Gianluca, you said it's all about the data when it comes to algorithm. And if the data is biased, then the algorithm are going to replicate some of the stereotype that society has. And in healthcare, again, you have hospitals that have been favoring white patients over Black patients because of who's biased. But I would like to add one thing, that it's easier to debias an algorithm than to debias a human brain. And in the case of the hospital I just mentioned, by tweaking the algorithm the right way, if indeed you bring your own ethical right framework on it, you can tweak the algorithm so that you don't have this bias anymore. So in a weird way, sometimes it's easier to have an algorithm, yes, there are biases, but then you can debias it in a way that try to convince someone to change its brain, or it's a much more difficult approach.
I just wonder if all the decision makers, all the people in management are actually thinking about it that way when they have to make day-to-day or even long-term decisions. I will follow that up again, but we actually have 3 questions popping in now, and looking at the clock, I better bring them in now. There is a question from Marcel Polfers, and it's for you, Catalina. Great insight, Catalina, he writes. Could you elaborate a little bit on how your statement that data is not driven or driving a decision fit into autonomous driving AI, etc.? So could you please elaborate a little bit on how your statement that data is not driving a decision fit into autonomous driving and artificial intelligence?
Well, I think this is more about semantic parameters, right? We're talking about driving. I don't really believe that data drives anything. I think that data are, to some extent, good data, correct data, representations of reality. So to that mind, if I can make a parenthesis also, Monika, going back to your old point about hiring and the use of AI in hiring, we can talk about data being biased, right? But if I look at, for instance, let's stay in the healthcare domain, I look at the hospital nurse population, it is a fact that most of them tend to be women. And so the data on hospital nurse employees would tend to show a higher proportion of women than men. Is this biased? If an algorithm gets trained on that, then you could argue, well, that just reflects the reality. Maybe it's a reality that you would like to change. I don't know whether you would or not. But the question of bias, I think it goes, if you want, beyond the data. It's a question of what is the structure of the reality that you're trying to capture and to understand. Now, going back to the question from Marcel on autonomous driving, of course, there's huge amounts of data generated by autonomous driving. I think there the interesting question, and that again veers into the ethical domain, is well, who bears ultimate responsibility? So who has the agency here? If we're talking about autonomous driving and about decisions that are fully taken by algorithms, is this the engineer coding the algorithm? Is it the company commercializing it? Or is this the driver who actually bought it and who delegated his driving responsibility to the machine? I don't have an answer to that. I think it's a right. question that ultimately merits obviously a broader discussion. But I think without that, we will not see autonomous driving taking flight anytime soon until we settle that question.
Sorry, if I may continue on what Catalina is saying, is data is driving machines type of decision. It's not driving human decisions. And it's very interesting, as you said, that you need a lot of data to train a machine, and the machine is going to be stuck on that data. It's not going to go far away from that data. That's why you need a lot of data. Look at how humans are learning to drive. It takes very few data points. I mean, compared to what the autonomous driving system are learning. You know, you try 1-2 hours, you already know how to drive better than a machine. And we can do that because indeed data is not what drives our decisions. It's because we have representations about how the world works, and we use those data to constrain our thinking. But this is really a representation that is driving our decision making. So yes, data maybe decide what the machine does, but I support fully what Catalina said. It does not drive the decision of humans.
All right, and I really have to spoil the fun here because we have 3 minutes still, and I have so many more questions coming in now. I have to pick one and try and get each and every one of you to answer that question because it sort of sums it up really. Now, there is so much information, distractions, a thin line between good and bad decisions, etc. At the end, however, of this decision chain, there is almost always one person in charge. Is it time to rethink generally the decision-making model and maybe look towards collective decisions or responsibility? We have 2.5 minutes. Who wants to shoot first? Gianluca.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually something that I was going to say to continue on Francis's point. So this question is extremely timely. In fact, I think there are 2 particular points in a decision-making process where responsibility really becomes crucial. One is what was just mentioned in this question, is at the end, a machine can give you recommendations that ultimately can inform the decision you make, but hopefully we will build systems where there always is an arbitrary time at which the human can make the final call. There's another point in the process where I'm really hopeful that we take this very seriously as one of those points in which ethics needs to be discussed as a core component, and that is what I would call the first mile in a decision-making process. When we design these algorithms, we build ethics into it. Whether we do it explicitly or not, that's where the discussion about ethics and values needs to happen. First mile and at the very end. Both of these respond to the responsibility principle raised by this question.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Gianluca. Francis.
Well, I disagree that all decisions are made by only one individual. I mean, if you think about democracy, for instance, it's a collective effort. And I would agree that the more diverse point of view you bring to the decision-making process, the better your decision is going to be. Now, then come the questions of who take the responsibilities. And it could be a collective responsibility. It can be whole government if you want, or it can be one person. But I don't believe that decisions in general are necessarily made by one dictator who is calling the shots. And to support what Catalina was saying in the beginning, it's possible, and this is what I foresee, that an AI recommendation would just be one part of a view coming from the data into the decision-making problem. And then we can have diverse opinions that bring diversity and different frames, different way of framing the problem that will probably provide a better outcome in the decision-making process.
Thank you, Francis. Catalina, you've got 20 seconds.
Yes, indeed. I would say I'm all for group decision-making, except that, of course, that comes at a cost. It's messy, it's complex, and it's difficult. However, there is value to it. And of course, there's always a trade-off. So, you know, I don't think decisions are always be made by groups. I don't think some decisions will always be made by one person. I think we need probably a little bit of both, depending on the decision and the discussion. But I do think that it should not be the machine. It should stay with the human.
Fantastic. That's a wonderful sentence to close this panel with. Thank you so much to all three of you. And thank you to the viewers. Sorry, I couldn't get more of your questions in, but yeah. Was too interesting, the discussion. And of course, there's another discussion coming up, the CEO talk, which will be moderated by Astrid Frohloff. So this will come up basically any moment now.